All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You should be working on the 3.4 section notes now. So after you finish the 3.3 notes, you should be working on this one. This is the presentation for that. Please take the notes like you did for 3.3 as I go along through. I'll try to highlight where or what kind of things I noted down. First of all, here with this section, it's going to be about the southern colonies. I think the very first thing you can do is put down this as your heading, Geography of the Southern Colonies. And then what I want you to do is maybe just list those 5 colonies. Now, they are listed down here. We have Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So go ahead and list those down as your 5 southern colonies. Then this here starts going into it's a line, an imaginary boundary line that kind of separates the southern colonies from the middle colonies. And eventually it will be used to separate slave states from free states. And it's going to be known as the Mason-Dixon line. And this first paragraph kind of gives you a background of where this Mason-Dixon line comes from. And really it just started out as a boundary dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania. 2 guys were hired to survey out the area where Pennsylvania and Maryland's boundaries began and ended, and then it becomes known as the Mason-Dixon line. And then throughout the rest of American history, the Mason-Dixon line still today is supposed to be that separation between the North and the South. Um, Down here in this second paragraph, it starts to get into more geography terms. So after you get your 5 colonies, you now get these couple of terms called the Tidewater and the Piedmont. I want you to have those down. The Tidewater was kind of this low, swampy area close to the Atlantic coast in these 5 colonies. And then as you went further inland towards the Appalachian Mountains, the land eventually gets a little bit rollier, more hilly, things like that. And that's known as the Piedmont area of these 5 colonies. Still used today, those 2 terms. And then, of course, this last paragraph talks about the climate being very warm and humid, and these hot summers lead to longer growing seasons. So, of course, it's going to be ideal for farming in the South. And some of the crops that they will have there specifically are tobacco and rice during colonial times. And then, of course, those crops will lead to slavery. Roman numeral number 2 here is about Virginia growing. Virginia was the first of these colonies. You had Jamestown, of course, in 1607. Then it becomes Virginia. You have the population grew very slowly in the beginnings of Virginia, and a lot of that had to deal with disease and the tough living conditions that these new settlers were not used to. But eventually, by about 1650, the death rate starts to fall, and then, of course, the population increases. And I put down there, in 1640, 10,000 settlers lived in Virginia. By 1670, 40,000 lived there. It was a pretty big increase. I also marked down that by the 1670s, there's a lot more kids and women in the colony now also. The next thing is going to have to deal with a couple conflicts in Virginia. This one here would be like A, 2A, Roman numeral 2A, conflicts with Native Americans. As Virginia's white population grew, the Native American population sank. One of the reasons why, of course, was disease, but also through violence. White Europeans coming over here and actually going to war with the Native Americans. There would be a lot of conflict, and that thinned out the population of Native Americans. Also, another thing is farmers are taking land away from the Native Americans. Farmers, they would want to plant more and more tobacco as it became more and more prosperous, and you could get rich and wealthy off of tobacco. Well, they're going to want more land to grow that tobacco on. Where are they going to get the land? Well, they're going to just take it from the Native Americans. There are a couple violent confrontations, but most times Native Americans are going to lose these battles, and eventually by 1644-ish, the Native Americans just have to learn to accept English rule or get out. Another conflict does not so much directly deal with the Native Americans. It's actually European settlers in Virginia area. They will have a conflict with Native Americans, and then that will boil over to a conflict with the government of Virginia. And that becomes known as Bacon's Rebellion. And so this would be 2B. Beginning in the 1660s, you have these wealthy tobacco planters taking up more and more land. Well, you also have settlers coming in from Europe. They want land because land equals power, land equals wealth. You also get voting rights with land. So these poorer colonists, they want land also, but it's being gobbled up by these large plantation owners. And so these people like Nathaniel Bacon, they're getting shoved further and further west where the Native Americans are. Well, eventually what happens is these poor farmers like Nathaniel Bacon, they start taking land away from the Native Americans. And then there's conflict with these Native Americans, and they start having battles out in the Piedmont or even in the backcountry. Well, Nathaniel Bacon wants the government to help, but they refuse to help. They want the House of Burgesses to help, deal with these Native Americans. But the governor of that time, he he has good relationships with the Native Americans, and they're trading with the Native Americans, especially the fur trade, and he doesn't want to ruin that trading. Well, Nathaniel Bacon's going to organize about 1,000 Westerners, and they're going to go rampaging against the Native Americans. This angers the governor. He tells them to knock it off. Well, then Nathaniel Bacon and his men, they turn towards Jamestown, and they actually go and burn down Jamestown, take over the House of Burgesses, and threaten the government and things like that. Eventually, Nathaniel Bacon is killed. This ends the revolt. A few dozen of his followers are also killed, but it goes to show that the English, the government, are not going to be able to stop these settlers from taking Native American land. And that's how it's going to be for the rest of colonial history. All right, now we move on to Maryland. Maryland, religious toleration in Maryland. What happens in 1632, King Charles I is going to give a friend of his, George Calvert, a charter for the English Catholics. Remember, these English Catholics, they're not practicing what Charles I wants them to practice. They're not practicing the right religion, but he wants them out of England. So he gives them land. It becomes known as Maryland. Now, Maryland becomes a place strictly for the Catholics. Now, Lord George Calvert's son is known as Lord Baltimore. He's going to take over the colony. When George Calvert, he dies pretty quickly into the building of Maryland. And he's going to set up a government pretty much like Virginia's House of Burgesses. They're going to grow tobacco in Maryland, and they're also going to use the sea, much like the colonies in New England do, for their riches and things like that. Now, one of the biggest things that Lord Baltimore does that helps out Maryland is he gets this document, this famous document called the Act of Toleration in 1649. He welcomes all Christians, not just Catholics now, or just Puritans or Anglicans, but all Christians can now be welcomed in Maryland. And if you're a Christian, you can vote and hold political office, not just Catholics. This allows more and more people to come into Maryland. It did not protect the non-Christians, though. So, of course, Native Americans aren't going to be protected. Many of the slaves are not going to be protected and things like that. But that's pretty much Maryland as it becomes a colony. Now we get number 4 here, colonies in the Carolinas and Georgia. By the 1660s, you're starting to get settlers from Virginia. They start actually going south out of Virginia's borders. So eventually King Charles II, he's going to grant a charter in 1663 to set up the Carolinas. And this is not a specific person or anything like that. It's kind of a group of people that are given a charter to set up the Carolinas. Now, the northern part actually develops a lot slower than the southern part, and a lot of that just has to deal with the geography of the area. The northern geography is a little harsher. There's not very many rivers. It lacks harbors for ships and things like that. So it takes a little longer for North Carolina to grow than it does for South. In North Carolina, you might have some small farms and maybe some tobacco, but mainly it was for the timber industry and stuff like that right here. In South Carolina, though, things are really going to take off, especially for plantations and things like that. So planters are going to come from the Caribbean, which would be on the map down here. They're actually going to come settle into the North Carolina area, and you're going to really have a lot of rice farming. The crop rice really grows well in the South Carolina humidity. Sugar also along parts of the areas here. But this is really going to lead to where a lot of slavery happens in South Carolina. And as that rice production grows here in South Carolina, you're going to get Charlestown, of course, named after King Charles, but it becomes the most populated city in all of the South. And it'll be that way all the way through the Civil War. Not very many cities in the South because most of the land is used for rice and tobacco, eventually for cotton growing. And then our last colony to get developed is Georgia. Georgia is set up as the last of the English colonies by James Oglethorpe. He's a wealthy Englishman. He wants somewhere he wants to develop something as a buffer zone between the southern Florida, right down here where the Spanish have control of an area, and the English colonies up here. And so he gets the King of England to give him a charter to set up a colony here for the debtors that are in England. So it actually opens up as a debtors colony where these imprisoned debtors can come to Georgia, work off the land and things like that, which would eventually pay off their debt. And that's what Georgia becomes. There's not really many large plantations in there yet in the beginning and things like that. In the beginning, Oglethorpe wants slavery to be outlawed, but eventually slavery will become legal in Georgia, just like the other southern colonies. All right, some changes in the southern colonies. A lot of changes will happen in the southern colonies. Really, there are two distinct lives. You have the haves and the have-nots, and really it's based on where you live. You have the Tidewater region, and you have the backcountry. So in the Tidewater region, this is where your wealthy planters are going to live. It's the best of the best land. And so in this backcountry region, you get the plantation owners who are going to be growing their tobacco, their sugar, their rice, eventually even the cotton. And it's going to be in this Tidewater region where the wealthy people also, they're very white, divide the white community also into the haves and have-nots. But with this wealth comes power and privilege. They're going to be able to vote. They're going to have all that privilege of voting and things like that. The backcountry, kind of like where Nathaniel Bacon was, would be poor. You have the poorer people of the South. They're living in what's known as the backcountry. We already explained the backcountry when we were doing the middle colonies. But they're very small farms. They live in one-room shacks. Very poor lifestyle and things like that. The women and the girls would be out in the fields with what traditionally would be for the men and the boys, but everybody had to help each other out just to survive. And it's really in this backcountry that they really feel that the people in the Tidewater regions do not like them, that actually they are actively working against the people in the backcountry, keeping them poor. They really believe that the colonial government, which is dominated by the planter class, so these people living in the Tidewater region, they dominate the government of these southern colonies, that they believe that they're developing laws that really keep the backcountry people down, keep them poor and things like that. Okay, so that's some of the big things to get out of this section here is first how these colonies develop, but then how you have these two distinct lifestyles of the Tidewater area and the backcountry, how they develop so much differently, and actually they're opposed to each other. All right, so that's pretty much it for here. One other note that I really want to tell you, just to make sure you're working on your brochure for whatever colony you are dealing with. Have it colorful, have it ready to turn in on Friday or Monday, depending on which class period you're in, and we'll be good to go. If you have any questions, as always, please contact me and by email and things like that. All right, good job, guys. Thanks.